Good morning, folks. David is my name. I'm going to be your host today. And today we're going through the design controls workflow for medical devices in Qualio. Before I get started, I want to jump into the main application itself. I'll do a brief introduction here just to help ensure we are all on the same page. This is Qualio. This is your cloud-based quality management system. As it's cloud-based, you won't need to download or install anything. Once you've accepted your invitation to your company's Qualio account and completed the setup of your user account, all you need to do is open your preferred browser, navigate to app.qualio.com and log in. Once you log in, you will land on your personalized dashboard, and from there, you can navigate through to the rest of the application. And this is my dashboard. At the top of the screen, we can see the navigation bar. There we can see the core features, documents and training, and we can see the tools that build on those core features. So again, documents and training are the core features, but then things like events, design controls, and suppliers are tools that support certain pre and post-market activities. And again, they build on documents. It's worth noting that some of the work required for design controls or product development will be done in Qualio documents. So again, some of the work required for product development or design control will be done in Qualio documents. I will, of course, highlight some of that work or some of those documents as we go through, but I will be focusing on the workflows within Qualio design controls. So that's my introduction. I'm going to quickly move through where to get support, where to pose questions if you have any questions. Once you're logged into Qualio, you can use the in-app chat, and through the in-app chat, you have access to all of the Qualio experts, and those Qualio experts are spread across North America and Europe. So with that, we can provide you with a near 24-hour support window. When you go to send us a message through the in-app chat, you'll see there's a number of different options. The first option is for access, and the reason why that's the first option is because events, design controls, and suppliers is by default disabled for all users. We can enable these features at the request of the company, and we can do it on a user-by-user basis or a company-wide basis. We can only fulfill those requests after users accept their invite. You also have options for different pathways. So if you have a quick question, you want to report something is not working, or if you have enhancement suggestions, you can use these options. And these are great because these allow us to qualify the question you're asking. So, you know, if something's not working, is your report related to documents, training, or events? Then we'll capture a screenshot in the format that we can accept in this channel. And then the support agent has all the information they need. So again, any questions, pop them through the in-app chat, and we can take it from there. So I'll jump in. This is the agenda. First, we'll take a look at some of the processes involved. And then we'll move on to creating requirements, you know, things like user needs, design input, design output. And then we'll look at assessing risk. And then finally, we'll look at reviewing and approving the requirements and risks that we create. Now, if anyone has any questions along the way, please feel free to use the Q&A option here in Zoom. We'll make time at the end to go through any questions, but do feel free to jot them down and pop them in, and we can go from there. Okay. First, let's talk a little bit about the standards and the regulations for design controls. The FDA states that manufacturers shall establish and maintain procedures to control the design of the device in order to ensure that specified design requirements are met. In the ISO standard 13485, clause 7.1, what they call product realization, this prioritizes establishing processes and techniques to design and develop medical devices with a focus on risk management. Now, going through that process, there are a number of challenges that the customers face when developing medical devices. For example, different functional groups or teams often work in multiple systems, but those systems don't speak to each other. And that results in a siloing effect that can hinder speed and collaboration. As well, working in those different systems generates different objects and artifacts, and uniting or tracing those artifacts can be burdensome, to say the least. And of course, generating the output or the documentation that ensures you are delivering a safe and effective product can be done in one place. So my next slide is just an illustration of the disparate systems problem. And then the next slide illustrates what we will achieve with Qualio. So effectively, Qualio unites your systems and data to enable effective and timely collaboration. It allows you to identify gaps proactively so you can take immediate action. And of course, it allows you to generate release documentation with ease. Okay, so let's develop a product. We have an idea, an infusion smart pump. What are the steps that we need to take to get this product off the ground? So there are a number of processes that we need to develop. Procedures and policies should be established in order to start the design process in a compliant manner. And some examples include like document control SOP, supplier evaluation SOP, risk management SOP. With that said, it's fairly common for an organization to develop a device before establishing a procedure or the various procedures that they need. And that can lead to things like missed compliance steps in the device's development. It may lead to ineffective procedures, procedures written out of context. It can lead to a disorganized process that requires a lot of resources to do a sort of retrospective cleanup. And ultimately, it will lead to messy audits that stem from all of these points. Some examples of the procedures that are required, things like document control, design control, electronic records, and signatures, to name but a few. This is not a definitive list. There are a number of procedures that you need to have in place. But that's not all. You also need to plan. Both the FDA and ISO require defined planning documentation. However, the format of that is unspecified. So there are several ways to plan or several methodologies to follow. Each offer a series of gates, stages, or phases. At the end of each phase, you have a checklist that you review, and you use that to ensure that you've completed or delivered what you need to deliver for each phase. But yeah, many organizations use the phased approach. Phases are generally broken down relative to the device's complexity. There's no one way to go about that. But then at each stage, risk is assessed, but then depending on the classification or complexity, you may do a design review at each stage, or you may just do a design review at the first stage, and then maybe at the last stage, or whatever way you have it broken down. So for our product, the smart pump, we have a design and development plan mapped out. I have a little video here just to highlight what that will look like. This is just an example. It's not set in stone. This may or may not suit what you need, but this is a Qualio document. Sorry, let me just rewind that a little bit. This is a Qualio document. The type is design and development plan. It's created in the documents section. So it's outside of design controls. Again, it's a controlled Qualio document. But this maps out the project definition, project scope, teams and responsibilities. Proposed indications, but then it goes on to map out the project phases. Now, in the case of this project or this product, we have mapped out 4 phases. And within that, we've mapped out all of the deliverables for each phase as well. So that's just an example of a design and development plan to help you get started. And then you'll use that as your sort of checklist as you progress through each design phase. Oh, it's doing it again. Sorry, let's just move on. Okay, so now let's go through those different phases. So we've seen our design and development plan. We are now in phase one, and we are going to start developing some of the objects for this phase. So phase one, project definition and planning. Now what we have here is a list of potential actions and artifacts. This is not a definitive list, but this is an example of some of the actions and required artifacts from like a phase one of the product's development. What's highlighted in that kind of blue purple are the objects that we will illustrate now after this slide. But I wanted to kind of highlight other items like the risk management plan. The risk management plan is another Qualio document. So like that design and development plan, that will be created on the documents side. Whereas things like design inputs, risk analysis, design review, the first two design inputs and risk analysis, they will be done in design controls, which we'll take a look at now in a moment. But then your design review, that'll be initiated in Qualio documents, but it'll be finished in design controls. And we'll take a look at that now. So the first thing we're going to do now is we're going to start developing our user needs and the subsequent design inputs. So once we have design controls turned on, and we have a product created or configured. So I've already created this product, it's been configured. So now what we do is we go into design controls, we open the tertiary infusion smart pump product, we navigate to the requirements section, and it's from here that we can start building our requirements. So what I've done here now is I've clicked the blue create button, and I'll continue from there. So when we're creating a requirement, we have a very short form to fill in. It only has a handful of sections: title, requirement type, description. There's a status field, which we'll see now in a moment, and then a field to link all of the requirements. So we're putting in our title or our summary of the requirement. We've selected the type, which is user need requirement, and then in the description field, we are documenting or stating that requirement. We've identified the status, and we've nothing to link to yet because, this is our first user need requirement, but that's fine. We'll move on. Now that we have documented our first requirement, we are now going to create a design input, which will link back to that user need requirement. So it's the same straightforward form with the handful of fields to fill in. And now we can start linking. So we can link back to the user need that we've already created. And that's our first design input. So we're going to continue. We're going to create a couple of more design inputs just to flesh out our first requirement. So we've got a couple more there. We're going to go on. We're going to add a few more. So we've added a whole bunch of design inputs. So that's it. That's our user needs and our inputs completed. So we're going to move on. So I'm going to play the same again. Let me just do this. Okay, so now that we have introduced a number of requirements, we need to assess these for risk. And when it comes to assessing risk or doing a risk assessment, you have two options in Qualio. One is your risk analysis or hazard analysis based on the ISO standard 14971. And this risk analysis is a required activity. It's focused on user interaction with a product and how that product could possibly contribute to harm, potential harm, through normal use or misuse. And then there's an example there. So in a nutshell, The hazard analysis based on the ISO standard is focused on potential harm to the patient through normal use or misuse. Failure mode, on the other hand, the other type of risk assessment you have available, it's a non-required activity, but it does allow you to focus on other aspects. This focuses more on potential device failure as opposed to potential harm to the patient. And now we'll take a look at performing a risk assessment. So now that we've created our user needs and our design inputs, we're going to move on to assessing those requirements for risk. Let me just pause before we continue. So earlier we were on the requirements tab in design controls. That's where we created our requirements. Now we're navigating to risk and we're going to begin assessing the requirements for risk. So you'll see you've got two options, one for ISO, one for FMEA. For everyone, the ISO is mandatory, FMEA is optional. So now we can go on, we can begin. Now, regardless of whether it is ISO or FMEA, your assessment form has the same sections, general and initial assessment. General allows you to title your risk. It allows you to identify a requirement as a source of a risk. So whether that's a user need or a design input or whatever it might be. And then the status allows you to identify where in the assessment process this risk sits. So we'll move on there. We'll give it a title. This is like a summary of the potential risk or failure mode. And now we're identifying the user need requirement as a source of this risk. We'll state where in the assessment process it sits, and then we'll move on to the initial assessment. This is where we document the potential hazards, potential hazardous situation, or potential harm. And then we can move on to determine the probability or severity of this potential harm. Once we input a probability and severity measure, that will determine the initial risk level. And we can see that here, the risk level is low. Depending on how your product is configured, a low level risk may or may not require risk control measures or mitigations. If risk control measures are required, additional fields will be made available for risk control and final assessment. So we'll see that now. So let me just wait and then I'll pause again. So we can see the additional sections for risk control and final assessment. With risk control, we have two fields here. The second field allows us to link to a requirement or perhaps a verification, an object that we have in place to support this mitigation process or this risk control measure. So, if you have a design input or a design output as risk control, or perhaps you have a verification test as risk control, you can link to that here. And then in the mitigation field, this allows you to put in like a summary description because all of the details will be here in this document. Once you have completed that mitigation process, you can move on to perform your final assessment to determine that residual risk level. So in this case, we've gone from low to low, so it's probably not a great example, but the intent here is if you have identified a risk with an unacceptable level of risk, you go through the mitigation process, and the idea is that mitigation process will result in a lower level of risk, a level of risk that is acceptable. And that's it. We've created our first risk object. We'll have identified a requirement as a source of that risk. And then we can move on to approving those objects, which we'll talk about on the next slide. Okay, so first we introduced a series of requirements. We brought in our user needs, design inputs, We assess them for risk. Now we're at the end of this design phase. And so we are going to initiate a design review. And how that is initiated, I suppose it can be done in many different ways. This is one example. It's a design review record. This is a Qualio document template, or at least an example of one. And it's through this Qualio document that you will initiate the design review process. You may not have something like design review record. Maybe you have something maybe more generic. Maybe it's just meeting minutes. That's absolutely fine. We can use whatever Qualio document to support the final sign off, which we'll see now in a moment. So you will initiate your design review in Qualio documents, but it will be completed in design controls, which we'll see now in a moment. So this is an example of a Qualio document that you can use to initiate a design review. But then on the next screen, we'll take a look at what that will look like in design controls. Okay. Okay, so where we are now is the product dashboard. And on the product dashboard, this is where we are notified about new design elements or changes to existing design elements. And we can see here under changes awaiting review, there are a number of objects with the status new. So this is indicating these are new design elements being introduced. And what we are getting prompted to do here is to initiate what we call a review. And we'll start that by clicking the blue Create Review button. That will generate a review form with a unique ID using the prefix DCC, or Design Change Control. And this form has a very short number of fields. You have a description field. Again, you can keep it high level. This can be like a summary description of what's been added or perhaps what's been changed. Design elements under review will point to all of the objects that we are reviewing. This is the phase 1 deliverable, so it's just a bunch of user needs and design inputs. And we've also assessed these requirements for risk, so we have the risk in there as well. And then we'll move on to select the quality level user to approve. You can have multiple approvers if you need. And then in the last field, related documents, this allows us to point back to a Qualio document. So if your design review was initiated as a Qualio document, you can reference that here. But in the example we have here, it's the design and development plan that we are referencing. You can reference as many documents as you need. So if you wanted to bring in your design and development plan, if you wanted to bring in like a design review, and maybe there was another document you wanted to reference, you can reference all of them here. And that will support what is getting approved through this process. So that's the review form completed or initiated. Once it's underway, it's available under this Reviews tab, and there we have two subsections, In Progress and Completed. To complete an In Progress review, simply click on the code ID, which we'll see now, and that will present us with the option to approve or decline. Now, when we're going through this process, if we wanted to dig into any of these details, all we need to do is simply click on any design element, and this preview drawer or panel will appear, and we get a lot of information here. So we have a notification to say it's untested. We can see the status, it's in draft, the requirement statement or description itself, the source. So in this case, it's design controls, it's not like Jira or anything like that. Relevant dates, the related design elements, all of the design inputs, the risk, and we can see the review history as well. Now, the review history is like a bird's eye view. It doesn't go into the detail, but you can click the DCC ID. Let me just go back there. Okay, review history. So once your review history lists like this, in that there are a number of DCCs, you won't see what has changed on this view, but simply click on any DCC ID, and then the details will be available in the description field. I zoomed in there. Okay, we're still previewing some of the objects. Okay, now we're happy with everything. We're ready to approve. we'll click approve, provide our signature details, and continue. Once all the approvers provide their signature details, that completes the review. And when a review is completed, it generates a series of files. And that includes a series of requirement specifications. Sorry, let me go back. A series of requirement specifications, your requirements trace matrix, your risk analysis matrix, and a test plan for validation and verification. And that is just the collected test cases and test results. The population of these files is cumulative. So every review you go through will build on the previous. Let's take a look at the trace matrix first. So this is the spreadsheet. This is the trace matrix that is automatically generated with the review process. We focused on the phase 1 deliverables, which was these user needs and design inputs. But if in phase 2 or when in phase 2, we are developing our design outputs, the trace matrix from DCC2 will include everything we see here, plus the data that we add on DCC2. So again, the population of these files is cumulative, and that will allow you to organically develop your trace matrix, your risk matrix, and so on. So we'll move on. We'll take a look at the risk matrix next. Now, at this point, only one risk was identified, so that's all the data we have to display. You'll see there's two options there. Actually, it's not letting me rid of. So you've got ISO and FMEA. So we saw earlier there are two options for performing a risk assessment. Both are offered on separate tabs. You have one format for ISO and a separate format for FMEA, but they're both offered on the same tab. And this is the format for ISO. Now we're going to take a look at the requirement specifications. That's the rec spec for user needs. There's only one user need. Now we'll take a look at the design inputs. This is a much more comprehensive list. We added a lot more data there. And that's our phase 1 completed. So we have created a user need, a series of design inputs. We've assessed them for risk. We've performed a design review, and we've used that to sign off on the objects that we created in that first phase. So now we're going to move on. Okay, so we have just completed the first phase. And so in terms of documentation, then, you'll go into your design history file. You will, this is another Qualio document. It's in the document side. It's not in design controls. The type is design history file. But this document has a section per phase. And similar to the design and development plan, this will list all of the deliverables required for each phase. Now that this phase is completed, we can go back and we can start linking to all of those objects. In the design and development plan then as well, we can update the phase 1 section. Similarly with the DHF, we can start linking to all of those objects for each phase or each deliverable. And then we can move on to phase 2. So again, we have a list of objects or artifacts and actions that are usually performed at this stage. In terms of example, I will illustrate creating design inputs in design controls. But then in terms of like your device master record or your technical file, that will be a Qualio document. And similar to the design and development plan or the DHF, that will require a template to be developed. It will be manually created in Qualio docs and then updated as required through the different phases. Traceability matrix, we've seen that'll get updated through each phase. Qualification of suppliers, that'll be done in the suppliers feature, which I'll lightly touch on right now, but there is a separate webinar for suppliers. And then we have a couple of more artifacts and actions. Risk analysis. Risk analysis will be done at every stage. That risk matrix will be updated then for every review you go through. Design review, again, initiated on Qualio Docs, finished in Design Controls. And then your draft verification and validation protocols. Again, it's kind of mixed bag. They'll be initiated or will there be some done in Qualio Docs, but then you'll be able to reference them or bring them into Design Controls. And we'll take a look at that now as well. The last row here is just more of a summary of all of the actions that we've just kind of gone through, but I'll move on anyway. So with this phase now, phase 2, we're going to focus on our design outputs. So we've created our user needs, we've created our design inputs, and now we're going to start developing our outputs. Oh, that was a bit quick. Let me just go back. Okay. How are we for time? Not too bad. Okay. So earlier, when we created our user needs and our design inputs, again, we were on the Tertiary Infusion Smart Pump in the requirements section for that product. And here we have the Create Design Element button, and this will allow us to create our requirements, things like design output, which is what we're going to do now. So again, we're using that very straightforward form. This time we've identified design output. We have a lot more detail to go into this one. We've identified the status, and now we're going to link it back to one of the design inputs that we have created earlier. We're going to go on and create a couple of more outputs. So now when we expand our user need and the relevant design inputs, we should see the outputs that have been traced to or linked to those inputs. So that's our design inputs created. Or outputs, I should say. Now what we're going to do is perform a gap analysis to identify any gaps in our design elements, and then we'll move on to drafting the verification and validations. So this open issues tab is your sort of gap analysis, and it allows you to identify gaps in your product's design elements. When we talk about design elements, we talk about requirements or risk. Requirements is a catch-all term to cover everything like user need, design input, design output, design verification, design validation, and any associated test evidence. For the most part, requirements can be created directly in Design Controls, but you will be able to link out to other artifacts like a Qualio document. So now in our Open Issues tab, we are looking for gaps in our design inputs or our risks. Now, when we land on our Open Issues page, there's a couple of items getting called out. There's a couple of objects with fields for links, but no links have been recorded. And there are a number of untested requirements. So this is what we're going to focus on now. We're going to focus on our user needs and our design inputs. So from my drop-down menu, I'm going to select user need. So I can see the one user need that we've created is an untested requirement. So I'm going to create a validation test to link to that user needs. And then there are a number of design inputs. And then I'll create a verification to link to some of those design inputs. So we'll start with the verification. And the form for your verification and your validation is similar to your requirements. So now we've created our design verification. We've tied it to one of our inputs. I'm actually going to link it to several inputs. So this design verification is traced to multiple design inputs. And now we're repeating the process for validation. So now when we go back to our Open Issues tab, what we're looking for now are the number of untested requirements to go down. So we added a verification test to 2 requirements. So the number of untested requirements has reduced from 8 to 6. And then for user needs, there was only 1 user need listed here, but we created a design validation and linked it to that user need. So we've used the gap analysis or open issues tab to identify gaps and fill in those gaps. And that brings us to the end of phase 2. That means that we can go on to update the phase 2 deliverables in our design and development plan and in our DHF. Okay, that brings me on to the last stage, or second last stage. It's the last stage where we'll be doing work in design controls. And again, we have a number of actions and artifacts that are likely to come up in this phase. And traceability matrix, again, the population of that file is cumulative. So every review you go through will build on the previous. So it's always getting updated itself. Risk analysis, again, V&V results and reports. This is what we're going to focus on the next slide. And then change control is just a summary of these last few actions. So we're going to focus on verification and validation results. On the next slide, we have a video. So let me just pause there for a moment. I need to skip up to about here. So here we have we've drafted our design validation or design verification. Someone has performed the protocols, and now we need to document the evidence. So we can see here what we're calling test case has been untested. So now we're going to take a look at adding the test results. And you can do that on the requirements tab. So earlier we were navigating here to create requirements and test cases. Test cases is the term we're using to cover validation and verification. You'll create those objects with the create design element button, but then test results is separate. And this will allow you to add like a pass fail result to any of the type of test cases you have created. And we've one of each as an example here. We have a design validation and a design verification. The result options you have available are passed, failed, and blocked. So you can associate a result with these test cases. You can record the date it was performed, note the person responsible, and then note any pertinent information as well. Now, if you want to add additional details, maybe additional results, it would be added on the design verification or on the design validation itself. So when you're filling out that short form, you will be able to link out to other Qualio objects to support the tests being conducted. So now we've added our test results. can go back and we can preview. So now it's recorded as a pass. And we'll use that same review process to approve all of the additional elements we've added. In the trace matrix, we can see this has been updated. So not only does it include all of the objects we added in phase 1, it now includes all of the objects we added both in phase 2 and in phase 3. And that brings me to the end of phase 3. Again, we can go in, update our design and development plan, update the phase 3 deliverable section. We can link all of the deliverable objects there, and we can do the same in our DHF. That brings us on to the design transfer and release process or stage. Now, a lot of the work at this stage will be done outside of design controls. So the work you've done in design controls is completed. A lot of the work that we're doing now is over on the Qualio document side. So your device master record, your technical file, you'll be finalizing those in Qualio documents. Your risk analysis or your risk management reports, all of that sort of thing, your risk management file, they will be Qualio documents. Regulatory clearance, again, Qualio documents. So at this stage, we've completed the work in design controls. We've developed our user needs. We've developed our design inputs and outputs. We've assessed everything for risk, and all of that has been approved. Now, at this stage, we are getting ready to send everything over to manufacturing. So we are finalizing all of the documents on the Qualio documents side. And then we have one more list of artifacts and actions. Again, you've got your design transfer checklist. That's going to be on Qualio documents. Your finalized design review, your final design review, again, initiated on Qualio documents, and same for your design history file. Now, I have an example of the design history file. Let me just move on. So this is the design and development plan. Again, you're going to update your design and development plan. You're going to link to all of these objects once they've been finalized. And then you're going to do the same in your design history file. So I have an example here. I'm going to hit play here. And I know we're coming up to the end and there's a couple of questions to go through. I hope everyone can hang on for a few minutes. See, we've lost a couple of people. But anyway, let me just finish by playing this video. Again, this is your design history file example. Each section reflects the design phase that was defined in the design and development plan. And in each section, we will list the deliverables required. So at the end of phase 1, we can link out to all of the phase 1 deliverables. At the end of phase 2, we can link out to all of the phase 2 deliverables, and same for phase 3 and phase 4. Okay, that brings me to an end of the presentation, folks. I hope you found it informative and helpful. I can see there's a couple of questions there. There's only one question really, so I'll take that now. If there's any other questions, do feel free to shout out. So there's a question there. Is there a design and development template we can use for all of our projects? So there is no one way to do design and development. We can offer you a template, and that template may or may not suit your product. You may determine that you need additional phases, and that's absolutely fine. But yes, we can give you an example. It's not a definitive example, and it may not suit your exact product or business needs, but it's a starting point at least. So I'll type the answer there. We can give you an example template Sorry, I have a slide for this. Okay, so yeah, the FDA and ISO are required defined planning. Many organizations create a development plan with phases or stages, and those phases or stages are broken down relative to the device's complexity. So the example that we have is for a more simple device, but if you have a complex device, you may determine that the example we provide may not be suitable. But again, it's a starting point and that I can absolutely make available with the recording for today's call or today's webinar. I'll just type that answer as well. I have another question there. Give me one moment so we can give you an example of today's webinar. Oh, and then there's a question in the chat. Okay, does a cumulative matrix get generated as new risks are identified, or will it just return to a single line matrix doc per risk requirement? So adding a risk will not create the matrix. To create the matrix, you need to initiate a review. So let me just jump into another screen. I know we're running over a couple of minutes over, so I hope you can hang on, but I'll do this quickly. So the question is, does adding a risk update the matrix? The answer simply is no. To update the matrix, you need to initiate what we call a review. So if I go in here and I add a risk, oh, there's a follow-up question there. So if the review has multiple risks being addressed, does it add to the risk matrix that was generated previously is what I'm gonna, it does add, it builds on the previous, but it doesn't iterate the initial, matrix that was generated. So I'm going to open this from the demo account. So your reviews will list in this manner. So in this case, we have DCC1. Each DCC has its own matrix. So in this case, the risk analysis matrix here is the original. We don't iterate this file. We generate a new copy, and on that new copy, the updated information is included. So in the example that you've provided, let's say on DCC2, we add additional risks. It will be on the matrix on DCC2 that we see those new risks. I hope that helps. I hope that answers your question. Perfect. I appreciate you hanging on. I know we ran over there. If there are any other questions, I don't mind hanging on for another minute or two. Otherwise, I'll thank you all for joining us today. I hope you found it helpful. If there are other questions that perhaps you don't have time to hang on for, feel free to pop them through the in-app chat, and the guys can route them for myself.